in Argentina with the death of the prosecutor. Don't you think the UN should do something?
Well, we have a shocking case of someone who was about to testify about a terrorist attack, and then he was murdered. And we have the president saying contradictory things. So I think, yes, I think the United Nations should speak out against this and to demand justice, to demand accountability, to demand the truth. And until now, I haven't seen much from the United Nations on this issue.
And are there any battles you wish you hadn't fought?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't thought about it. We're fighting battles every day. So no, on the whole, I think most of our battles are pretty clear. We're fighting the worst regimes. We fought Gaddafi. We're fighting Assad. We're fighting the communist regime of Cuba. And normally on those battles, the things are very clear, and we're proud of the work that we're doing.
Are we about to see the surge of a Mexican chapter of UN Watch? And how can we help as a Jewish website?
Well, that's a very good question. UN Watch believes it's very important that our information be available in Spanish. There's a whole Spanish-speaking audience of hundreds of millions of people that don't always have as good access to these things because sometimes things are only in English. So UN Watch created, through volunteers, a Spanish version of our website, and we invite people to visit it. And it hasn't been updated recently, but we intend to update this. And people can sign up on our website to unwatch.org and to choose to get the Spanish newsletter. And we invite people to take our information, and if it's not translated, if they don't see it on our Spanish website, they should translate it themselves. And we invite people to sign up on our website. If they're signed up, they'll get information when we have a campaign to sign a petition. And if there is a sufficient amount of people who are active and who are aware of the issues, we'd be very happy to have a branch of UN Watch here in Mexico City as something that could be a capital for the whole entire Spanish-speaking world. I know that Mexico is very much a capital for information in the Jewish world and the Israel world in Spanish, and I think it could be an excellent opportunity to spread the information not only about equal treatment for Israel, but about making sure the United Nations addresses the real problems of human rights that are not today being addressed properly.
UN Watch was founded in 1993 by a Jew, Maurice Berthold Abram, who was also the president of the American Jewish Committee. Abram thought that the UN was an indispensable institution and that the US should not withhold its support from it. Based on the US structure and its numbers, do you think it is still indispensable, and should the US still fund it?
Well, the UN is not going away, and the issue of US funding it's really a non-issue. The US will continue to fund the United Nations. Look, even George W. Bush, who was a skeptical president in regards to the United Nations, and he had an ambassador named John Bolton, who was the most UN skeptical ambassador that they ever had to the United Nations. They never proposed to stop funding of the United Nations. America gets a good deal in some areas. America has a seat on the Security Council. America is not the superpower that it used to be, but at the United Nations it can veto resolutions, as can China, Russia, France, and the UK. So I think on the whole, America is going to continue funding the UN, and the fact that it's in New York gives them a certain influence over what happens at the UN. But at the same time, they don't have to fund everything. They can make statements from time to time saying we're not going to fund that. Indeed, they stopped funding UNESCO, Congress, because they had taken a one-sided decision to recognize a so-called country called Palestine. And I believe that America, before we get to the issues of funding, America can use its seat at the UN to speak the truth and to say that at the Human Rights Council they appointed a man named Jean Ziegler to be the expert on hunger. Jean Ziegler is someone who created the Muammar Gaddafi Human Rights Prize, and he was a close friend of Castro. And so he's a friend of Gaddafi, a friend of Castro. That's how he got to be an expert on hunger, where he attacked Israel for quote-unquote starving Palestinians. America needs to speak out when people like that are sitting at the United Nations. And it does so to some degree, but not enough. And with the Human Rights Council, America joined, and they said, well, now that we joined, it's getting better. Well, not really. They did a few things that were good, but on the whole, the Human Rights Council continues to elect the worst abusers. Last year, once again, they elected China, Russia, Cuba, Saudi Arabia. A few weeks ago, they elected Qatar. America doesn't speak out on these issues. So before we even get into the funding issues, you know, America, you have your seat. We understand you're not going away. Use your seat, use your microphone to speak the truth. It's very important. And that's what I ask my American friends to do.
Talking about Qatar, it is kind of invading a little bit the states, no?
Yes, well, Qatar is a regime that has supported Hamas. They've supported terrorism. They have hundreds of thousands of migrant workers that they treat as slaves. There was an estimate that 10 or 20 were going to die every day to build the infrastructure for the soccer tournament, which now they may not hold the World Cup. So Qatar is a terrible country when it comes on to human rights, women's rights, and other issues, and the fact that they're using their billions of dollars to buy influence in France and to buy soccer teams in Spain, and thankfully, I believe the team in Spain, I think it's Barcelona, has indicated they may no longer accept sponsorship of Qatar Airways. And I ask, how is it that a soccer team, a football team, Barcelona, is saying because of human rights we are considering to reject sponsorship from Qatar Airways, and yet the Human Rights Council just elected Qatar to be one of their members, and they do not consider rejecting them. So I think that these are questions that need to be asked at the United Nations.
And Hillel, you have the Hebrew name of a leader associated with Jewish law, Mishnah, and Talmud. Has your name influenced your profession, your defense of Israel, and your joining of UN Watch?
Well, it's a good question. I haven't thought about it in a conscious way, but you know, names are very powerful. Names are very powerful. Name is destiny. Names are very, very, very powerful. And if you call things by their right name, and if you call things by their wrong name, you know, the philosopher Albert Camus, said in 1944 that calling things by their wrong names adds misery to the world. Calling things by their wrong name, and we see it. We talked before about violent Islam. How no one's able to say that in America. You're not allowed to use those words anymore in American government documents, and we see that by failing to calling things by their right name, calling things by their wrong name has added misery to the world. So coming back to names, obviously it does have an influence. And Hillel, as you said, was a sage at the time of the Second Temple, and his message was one of tolerance and patience and peace. In Jewish law, the law is according to Hillel, I believe, all the time, because he used to have debates with Shammai, and the law, I think, is always according to Hillel, except for a handful of cases. I think 8 cases that's according to Shammai. So the message of Judaism is a message of tolerance, and it's meant to be religion that is open-minded. And so I hope that in my own work, that in defending the right of the Jewish people to exist and the right of Israel to exist, that I am upholding the tradition of Hillel, but also that my work on human rights and to have the millions of victims around the world whose plight is ignored, and to put a spotlight on their issues, to give them their day in court, also reflects the open-minded, tolerant position of Hillel as well.
How can Israel do to have a better image in the world?
I think there's a lot of things that Israel needs to do, and there are some things that Israel cannot do. And let me speak about both. What it must do, it has to have articulate spokespersons. It does have several. Other times it puts people up who are less qualified, and that's unfortunate. So I think it has to invest in its people. We're beginning to see some universities, some college programs investing in their people and their abilities. Israel has to invest more money and resources in its foreign ministry. It is said now that Israel, compared to countries that don't have such challenges in terms of public relations, invest tens times more resources in their diplomacy. So Israel needs to invest in its diplomacy. It's not enough to buy tanks and planes if the tanks and planes can't move because public opinion is against you, because you've lost in the court of public opinion, because you've lost at the United Nations, and then you might have won territory, but then you have to retreat, and that happens. So you have to, Israelis have to recognize the importance of the diplomatic arena, and they have to invest in it. And I think in Israel there is a reluctance. People, if they see a budget and they say we're investing $100 million to buy a new jet, so, oh yes, of course we need the new jet. If they saw we're investing $20 million to invest in education of our diplomats, in law, in politics, in writing, in speaking, I think that Israelis would be, well, do we really need that? And you do need it. So I think that we have to have a greater awareness and to make it a priority. And I think we're beginning to see more. I think on social media, we're seeing a much more attention being paid by Israel. But then it's important to know what Israel cannot do. And people often ask me, they say, oh, how is it in Europe? Everyone's against Israel. It's time for Israel to do better hasbara. Israel has to do better public relations. And I say, yes, they do. But let us not think for a moment that the terrible attitude towards Israel is a consequence, is a product of what Israelis did or didn't do. Assad doesn't have such good PR. Arafat was terrible PR. Yes, he had Ashrawi, but for years he was giving interviews. He said things that were awful. He didn't look very good. He was not, by any means, he was not someone who you would pick as your ultimate PR spokesman. Okay, but the world was interested in his product, and his product was attacking the Jews. And let us be honest, that if your product is that I'm going to show the moral failings of the Jews by showing a Palestinian child who was killed, it'll get on the front page. And I remember we had the flotilla incident of 2010, and the initial images were Israelis beating innocent humanitarians, but by the end of the day, the images came out of the so-called humanitarians who were Turkish militants with iron bars who were beating the Israelis. So by the end of the day, both images were available. When I went to my newsstand in Geneva the next day, the newspapers all had the same picture of an Israeli soldier with a gun like this. Now, the editors of all the newspapers had both images available, and they all chose to do one. So was it the fault of PR? No, the editor is in his mindset thinking what his readership wants to see. And sadly, the readership across Europe and in other countries wants to see the evil Israeli and to show the moral failings of the Jews. And someone named Mati Friedman, who used to work for the Associated Press, wrote about how it worked as covering Israel for the Associated Press in Jerusalem, saying essentially the same thing. So let us not for a moment think that the terrible image of Israel is because of what we did do or didn't do. It's because, sadly, in the world, there are many who want to have an image of Israel as a demon, as someone who is drinking the blood of innocent Palestinians. And it's the same motifs that we had for 2,000 years in Christian civilization, and has now taken on a somewhat different guise, where instead of the Jew, it's the Jewish state, Israel. And so I think it's very important that we should criticize the failings of Israeli PR, but let us not fail to call things by the right name. And the reason that the image of Israel in the media is so hostile is because Israel is a Jewish state. And there was a poll in England, a survey, and after North Korea, I think the most hated country in the world was Israel. And there's no objective reason for that, but that's the reality.